There is a pattern in human civilization that historians have documented, sociologists have measured, and psychologists have quietly confirmed. Across every era, across every culture, across every form of government and every economic system ever devised, the people who reach the top are rarely the best of us. They are, disproportionately, the darkest of us. Not always, but often enough that the pattern cannot be dismissed as coincidence. Often enough that researchers have begun to ask a question that most people are afraid to ask out loud. What if it is not a bug in the system that dark triad personalities keep ending up in power? What if it is the entire point of the system? By the end of this video, you will understand something that will change the way you look at every hierarchy you have ever been part of. Because the hierarchies of our world, corporate, political, social, even religious, do not merely tolerate dark triad personalities. They are structurally shaped over centuries to elevate them. And once you see this pattern, you cannot unsee it. Let me start with the most disturbing finding in modern organizational psychology. The higher you climb in any hierarchy, the higher the concentration of dark triad traits becomes. This is not opinion, this is data. Studies of senior executives across multiple industries have consistently shown that measurable levels of narcissism, Machiavellianism, and psychopathy increase as you move from entry-level positions to middle management to senior leadership to the very top of organizations. At the base of most hierarchies, the personality distribution roughly matches the general population. By the middle levels, the elevation is measurable but modest. By the executive suite, the concentration is startling. And at the very peak, the CEOs, the founders, the political leaders, the heads of major institutions, the levels of certain dark triad traits often exceed the general population by 3 to 4 times. This is not because ordinary people become dark triad personalities as they climb. Personality traits are remarkably stable across the lifespan. Someone who is not psychopathic at 30 does not become psychopathic at 50 simply because they got promoted. Which means the pattern must be caused by something else. It must be caused by the filter. The mechanisms by which people ascend the hierarchy must be selecting for these traits, deliberately or accidentally, such that at every level, a slightly larger proportion of dark triad personalities pass through, while ethical, humble, careful individuals are increasingly filtered out. The question is not why the top is dark. The question is how the filter got built. Let me show you exactly how the filter operates. Because once you see the mechanisms, you will realize that this is not a conspiracy. It is a design flaw so deep and so widespread that most societies do not even recognize it as a flaw. The first mechanism is the willingness to seek power. Most healthy people do not intensely desire to be in charge of large numbers of other people. This is not weakness. It is proportion. Healthy people understand that power comes with responsibility, exposure, complexity, and the requirement to make decisions that affect the lives of others. They may accept leadership when it is offered. They may pursue it when they feel called, but they rarely hunger for it as an end in itself. Dark triad personalities are different. Power is not a burden they might reluctantly accept. It is oxygen. They need it. They pursue it. They dedicate the entirety of their strategic intelligence to acquiring it. In any competition for leadership, this asymmetry is decisive. The healthy candidate might apply. The dark triad candidate campaigns. The healthy candidate might mention their qualifications. The dark triad candidate builds a strategic narrative around themselves months in advance. The healthy candidate might allow the process to unfold. The dark triad candidate shapes the process, courts the decision makers, positions the competitors, and controls the timeline. The result, across thousands of small selection events over decades, is not that dark triad personalities always win. It is that they win far more often than random chance would predict. And in a system where selection compounds, where each promotion enables the next. Even a small statistical advantage at every level produces an enormous concentration at the top. The filter does not need to be perfectly biased. It only needs to be slightly biased. Over enough iterations, slight bias becomes overwhelming imbalance. The second mechanism is the willingness to act without moral drag. Every leadership position, at every level, requires making decisions that harm some people. You cannot lead without occasionally firing someone, without denying a request, without prioritizing one project over another, without disappointing people whose disappointment matters. Healthy people experience emotional drag when they make these decisions. They lose sleep, they agonize, they try to soften the blow, they sometimes hesitate longer than they should. They occasionally make suboptimal decisions because the human cost weighs too heavily on their conscience. This drag is not a flaw, it is a feature of being a decent human being. But in a competitive environment, it is a disadvantage. Because the leader who does not experience this drag can move faster. They can fire without hesitation. They can restructure without guilt. They can pivot strategies without carrying the psychological weight of what the pivot cost the people beneath them. They appear, from the outside, as more decisive, more strategic, more capable of executing under pressure. In reality, they are not more capable, they are more free, because they lack the internal resistance that slows down ethical decision-makers. And boards, investors, and superiors reward what they see. They see decisiveness, they see execution, they see results delivered without hand-wringing. They do not see the emotional cost paid by the humans further down the hierarchy. They rarely calculate the long-term damage to team morale, institutional trust, or organizational health. So the leader who can act without moral drag rises. The leader who cannot, the leader who feels every decision in their bones, appears slower, softer, less suited to the demands of high-pressure leadership. This is not because they are less suited. It is because the measurement system does not weigh what they carry. The filter measures speed. It does not measure conscience. The third mechanism is the sophistication of impression management. Most people, when meeting a stranger, form an impression within seconds and update it slowly over time. This is a cognitive shortcut. The brain cannot afford to reevaluate every person from scratch at every interaction. So it forms a first impression, files it, and uses that impression as the default reference point for all future interactions. Dark Triad personalities understand this instinctively, and they exploit it with a precision that most ethical people cannot match. They know that the impression they create in the first 30 seconds of any high-stakes interaction will color every judgment about them for months, sometimes years. So they invest enormous energy in that first impression. They dress deliberately, speak crisply, make eye contact confidently, deploy the specific vocabulary that signals sophistication in the environment they are trying to enter. Manage their body language with the precision of a trained actor. Meanwhile, most talented but ethical people show up as themselves. They assume that competence will speak for itself over time. They do not perform, they present. The problem is that hiring committees, promotion boards, investors, voters, and social hierarchies of every kind do not have time to fully evaluate competence. They rely disproportionately on first impressions. And the person who has engineered their first impression will almost always beat the person who did not think to engineer one. This is why the world is full of successful people who are, upon closer examination, deeply mediocre at their actual jobs, and full of failed people who are, upon closer examination, exceptional at theirs. The filter is not measuring what the roles require. The filter is measuring what a 5-minute meeting can perceive. And in a 5-minute meeting, the impression manager always wins. The fourth mechanism is what economists call the confidence-competence gap. Extensive research has shown that in most professional and social evaluations, people mistake confidence for competence. They assume that the person who speaks with certainty must know what they are talking about. They assume that the person who volunteers a strong opinion must have grounds for that opinion. They assume that the person who does not hedge, does not qualify, does not admit uncertainty, is simply more knowledgeable than the person who does. This is a cognitive error, but it is a nearly universal one. Now consider who benefits from this error. Ethical, careful, competent people tend to acknowledge uncertainty. They say things like, "I think," or "My understanding is," or "This is what the data suggests, but there are edge cases." They do this because it is intellectually honest. Dark Triad personalities do not do this. They speak with certainty about things they do not fully understand. They make definitive statements where a careful expert would hedge. They present as authorities on topics they have only surface-level knowledge of. Most listeners cannot tell the difference between real competence and performed confidence. So they weight the confident speaker as more credible. In classrooms, in meetings, on television, in political debates, in boardrooms, the person who says, "I do not know," is perceived as weak. The person who confidently states an incorrect fact is perceived as strong. This is a catastrophic misalignment, because in reality, the person who says, "I do not know," is often the more capable one. They have enough understanding to recognize the boundaries of their own knowledge. The confident speaker often lacks that understanding, but the filter cannot tell the difference. And Dark Triad personalities have known this since they were children. They watch their humble, careful classmates get overlooked. They watch their loud, certain classmates get admired. They learned very early which strategy the world rewards. And they have been executing that strategy ever since. Now, if you have made it this far, you already understand the mechanics of the filter. But the most important part of this video is coming next. Because I have shown you how Dark Triad personalities pass through the filter, now I need to show you what happens once enough of them have passed through, once the system itself has been reshaped by their presence. This is where the analysis moves beyond individual pathology and into what historians and philosophers have long recognized as one of the most difficult problems in human civilization: the problem of institutional capture. Because when Dark Triad personalities reach the top of a hierarchy, they do not simply exist there. They rewrite the hierarchy in their own image. And the version of the hierarchy they leave behind is one that is even better at filtering for the next generation of people like themselves. Let me show you exactly how this happens. Once Dark Triad personalities occupy leadership positions, they do three things that permanently alter the institution beneath them. The first thing they do is change the promotion criteria. Not officially, not publicly, nowhere on paper. But quietly, through countless small decisions, they begin to promote people who resemble themselves. Not because they are strategizing to entrench their kind, because they, like all humans, are pattern matching. They see themselves in candidates who share their traits: confidence, willingness to self-promote, comfort with strategic maneuvering, ease with delivering difficult decisions. And they see weakness in candidates who exhibit humility, caution, or moral hesitation. Over time, this pattern matching becomes institutional culture. The people who reach senior positions all share a certain profile. The people who do not reach those positions are systematically told, in 1,000 small ways, that they lack executive presence, that they need to be more decisive, that they need to speak with more authority. What these employees are actually being told, in encoded form, is, "Become more like us, or you will not rise." Some of them try, some of them succeed at performing the required qualities, some of them refuse and eventually leave. And after a decade of this, the organization is no longer capable of promoting a genuinely ethical, humble leader. because the entire promotion apparatus is now calibrated around Dark Triad markers. The filter has been rebuilt from the inside. The second thing they do is redefine what counts as loyalty. In healthy organizations, loyalty means commitment to the mission, to the customer, to the long-term health of the institution. In institutions captured by Dark Triad leaders, loyalty is redefined as personal allegiance to the leader. You are not loyal because you protect the company from bad decisions. You are loyal because you defend the leader in meetings. You are loyal because you do not question their strategy. You are loyal because you deliver the message they want delivered, in the tone they want it delivered in. This redefinition is subtle. It rarely happens through explicit demands. It happens through selective favor. The employee who dares to disagree with the leader, even respectfully, even correctly, finds themselves quietly excluded from important meetings. The employee who defers, agrees, and echoes finds themselves inexplicably included. Within a few years, the organization has learned. The unspoken rule has been transmitted. Loyalty is not to the truth. Loyalty is to the person. And this is precisely the culture in which Dark Triad leaders can operate without check. Because everyone has learned that the price of speaking truth is exclusion from power. And exclusion from power, in most people's careers, is unaffordable. So the emperor's new clothes remain uncriticized. Disastrous strategies are executed enthusiastically. Obvious failures are reframed as external factors. And the leader continues to be treated as a genius, even by intelligent subordinates who privately know better. Institutional courage collapses. And courage, once collapsed, does not easily rebuild. The third thing they do is eliminate the mechanisms of accountability. In every hierarchy, there are internal checks, boards, ethics committees, independent auditors, cultural norms about what a leader can and cannot do. Dark Triad leaders, upon reaching power, systematically weaken these mechanisms. Not through overt attack, that would draw attention. Through appointments, they appoint their allies to oversight positions. They advocate for board members who defer to them rather than challenge them. They restructure reporting relationships so that the people who could raise concerns now report to the people who benefit from suppressing them. They install processes that appear to increase transparency, but actually reduce the flow of critical information to the people who could act on it. They cultivate relationships with regulators, journalists, and industry observers such that criticism of them gets dampened before it reaches the public. By the time an outside observer might notice that something is wrong, the internal machinery for correction has already been dismantled. This is why institutional decay is often invisible until it is catastrophic. The mechanisms that should have caught the problem years earlier were quietly disabled, not through corruption in the criminal sense, but through the sustained influence of leaders who benefited from their disability. The Dark Triad leader is not usually caught by the systems designed to catch them, because they redesigned those systems long before the catch became necessary. Now let me speak to what this means at scale. Because if the pattern I have just described plays out in a single company, it is a tragedy. Employees suffer. Talent is wasted. A once great institution becomes hollow. But this pattern is not confined to single companies. It plays out at the level of industries, at the level of governments, at the level of entire civilizations. Political theorists have long observed that democracies, oligarchies, monarchies, and every other form of governance humans have ever tried tend to concentrate power in the hands of individuals with elevated Dark Triad traits. Not always, but often enough to shape the arc of history. This is why so many revolutions, carried out in the name of the people, promising a better future, end up producing new tyrannies. Because the traits required to seize power are often the traits that make someone unfit to wield it responsibly. This is why so many social movements, founded on genuine idealism, end up captured by opportunists within a decade. Because the opportunists show up quickly, work harder to position themselves, and are willing to say and do whatever is required to seize control of the emerging institution. This is why so many industries, born from real innovation, end up dominated by companies whose leadership is measurably more ruthless than their founders. Because as the industry matures, the filter for leadership tightens around exactly the traits I have described in this video. The pattern is not a modern phenomenon. It has been observed by philosophers going back thousands of years. Plato worried about it, Machiavelli described it, Nietzsche warned about it. Robert Mitchells formalized it in what he called the iron law of oligarchy. The observation that all organizations, no matter how democratic they begin, eventually concentrate power in the hands of a small elite. The iron law is not really about oligarchy. It is about personality. The elites that emerge are not random samples of humanity. They are systematically selected. And what they are selected for is precisely what I have been describing. Confidence over competence. Certainty over wisdom. Ruthlessness over conscience. Impression over substance. This is not the story of a few bad apples. This is the structure of human hierarchy. And unless the structure changes, the story will keep repeating. So what do you do with this? The temptation is to give up. To decide that if the system is this deeply rigged, there is no point in trying. To become cynical. To conclude that ethical leadership is impossible and that only naive people believe otherwise. Do not fall into this trap. Because cynicism is exactly what serves the pattern I have described. Cynicism produces disengagement. Disengagement empties the room of ethical people. And an empty room is easier to fill with Dark Triad candidates than a full one. The alternative is harder, but it is the only real path. The alternative is that ethical people learn the game, not to play it dishonestly, to play it competently. Because here is the deepest truth of everything I have told you. Dark Triad personalities have one enormous vulnerability. They assume that ethical people are incompetent at political skill. They have been assuming this since childhood. Their entire career strategy is built on the belief that they will outmaneuver, outposition, and out-narrate anyone with a conscience. The moment ethical people become competent at political skill while keeping their ethics intact, the entire filter changes. Because now the filter is no longer selecting for Dark Triad traits. It is selecting for the combination of ethics plus fluency. And that combination is rare, powerful, and once it enters a hierarchy, it can spread. The person of substance who also knows how to be seen. The careful thinker who also knows how to speak with clarity. The humble contributor who also knows how to advocate for their own work. The conscientious decision-maker who also knows how to move with speed when speed is required. These people are not sacrificing their ethics. They are simply refusing to sacrifice their effectiveness. And when enough of them enter any given hierarchy, the culture begins to shift. Slowly at first, then unmistakably. Institutional patterns can be broken. Filters can be recalibrated. Cultures can be reformed. It is difficult, and it is slow, and it takes generations of committed people who refuse to accept that darkness is inevitable at the top. But it is not impossible. The Dark Triad rises through hierarchies because too few ethical people know how to compete with them. Change that, and you change the world. Let me leave you with one final thought. The pattern I have described in this video is not evidence that human beings are fundamentally corrupt. It is evidence that certain patterns of institutional design tend to reward certain patterns of behavior. Different designs produce different outcomes. The best institutions in human history, the ones that have produced the most flourishing, the most creativity, the most well-being, were not the ones with the harshest hierarchies. They were the ones with the most careful safeguards against the concentration of unchecked power. They created distributed decision-making. They created transparency mechanisms that could not be captured. They created cultures where speaking truth to power was celebrated rather than punished. They created traditions of ethical courage that were transmitted across generations. None of these institutions were perfect. All of them eventually decayed to some degree. But at their peak, they proved that the pattern I have described is not an iron law. It is a tendency, and tendencies can be resisted. The question for you, and for me, and for anyone who has watched this video, is whether we will build such institutions in our own lifetimes. In our companies, in our communities, in our families, in our nations. Whether we will insist on transparency where the current pattern hides. Whether we will insist on accountability where the current pattern erodes. Whether we will insist on humility as a leadership qualification where the current pattern rewards its opposite. None of this is easy. But everything I have described in this video was built by people. And what people build, other people can build differently. The top of every hierarchy is not naturally dark. It has been made dark by choices, millions of small choices made across centuries that could have been made otherwise. We are the ones alive now. The choices from here forward are ours. If this video changed the way you understand power, hit the like button. It genuinely helps this channel reach the people who need this message most. Subscribe if you want more content that pulls back the curtain on the psychology of power, leadership, and human civilization. And in the comments below, I want to know, do you believe the pattern I described in this video is inevitable? Or do you believe ethical people can genuinely reshape the top of human hierarchies? I want to hear your honest answer. In my next video, I'm going to reveal something that even most trained psychologists misunderstand: the exact childhood conditions that produce Dark Triad personalities, the specific traumas, the specific patterns of parenting, the specific environments that shape a mind into what we have been describing, and what this understanding means for how we treat, prevent, and heal these personalities across generations. You do not want to miss it. Until then, stay awake, stay aware. And remember, the world was not made by the ruthless. It was made by the courageous. Be one of the courageous, because the darkness at the top rises when the ethical stay silent. And silence is the one gift they do not deserve.